Hi, I'm real excited to talk about storytelling and adult development in tabletop role playing games. My name is Joe. I'm a geek and a gamer, but I'm also a studier of leadership development, group dynamics, and games. So I think adult development explains why storytelling is so meaningful because stories help us tap into some of those aspects of ourselves that we need to grow and develop, and that we do this process through storytelling and with stories. And when we're able to do that in a play environment, like a role playing game, we can use the stories and adult development together to access that growth within ourselves. We can facilitate this process through play, which is really powerful process. And we do that together in a role playing game. So we're acting with other people. And this goes all the way back through the history of storytelling as human nature, and also the nature of human development as a common experience to all human beings, just like storytelling. And so we can play through our development in stories and in role playing games in particular. And it's unique in role playing games because it's interactive and we're using a co creative process. I also think this is what ultimately makes games like Dungeons and Dragons accessible to everyone because we all have the same journey of adult development. We're on our own individual journeys, but we're all on a journey of adult development, and all cultures can tap into these same concepts and have stories and common story structure. So a few disclaimers. Not all games of Dungeons and Dragons are going to be transformative or super meaningful, or maybe that you don't want it to be that. So it's not all games, and not everyone needs to play role-playing games to develop as an individual. This is just ways for people who do like it to be able to do that or explain how it's already happening anyway, or for people who don't realize that they love this game yet to be able to connect around adult development as a way of getting into the game. Yes, Dungeons and Dragons is a useful tool and has been used for therapy and has therapeutic outcomes related to self-esteem and personal transformation and social skills and all of that. And that is all great and useful ways to implement Dungeons and Dragons. I think that leadership development and adult development can happen that is not necessarily therapy. And so we can use this in a non-therapy but therapy-related way to grow together, and it doesn't need to be therapy in a sense. Okay, so let's talk about adult development. What is adult development? Well, in a nutshell, it's learning to think and feel with more complexity and hold more complex thoughts and feelings in our conscious awareness. And the feelings part of this is really important because no matter how complex the amount of ideas that you can hold at one time is, we also develop in affective and spiritual ways as well. And so it's really important to notice that holding all of that together and learning to build that is the process of adult development. It's also this process of bringing what is in our unconscious and not aware to us in our consciousness into unity with our consciousness and becoming more aware of those other aspects of ourselves and incorporating that into our conscious being. And so I use a couple theories here to help explain this. One is Carl Jung, who is a Swiss psychologist. He inspired the work of Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And this was the hero's journey, which is a common narrative structure that we're familiar with that goes across cultures. I'm also going to use D.W. Winnicott and to explain how play is the process of adult development and the aspects of that allow this to happen in our role-playing games. Let's start with Carl Jung and the idea of consciousness. So Jung believed that there were three different levels of consciousness. It begins with our conscious awareness, that which we know we have and are aware of in our thoughts. Underneath that, things that we are unaware of is our personal unconscious. Now, our personal unconscious are those aspects that we either repress or haven't realized are actually part of us, but they're unique to us as individuals. So it's our personal unconsciousness. Jung also introduced the idea of the collective unconscious. And this is the idea that there is a collective, common to all human beings aspect of unconsciousness that we all inherit and exhibit, and that this collective is expressed through archetypes. And that's how we can see it across cultures in myths and legends, rituals and religions. So there are many different archetypes or expressions of the collective unconscious. Pearson Marr identified kind of a taxonomy for the magician, warrior, lover, seeker, destroyer, creator, jester, and there are others like the trickster, the tyrant, the weakling. And among all of these, they show up in our stories and in our myths and rituals as human beings across cultures. And this is how we can see these different archetypes that some of us identify more with it or in our own consciousness than others, but they're common parts of all of this collective unconscious. Among the many archetypes that are talked about, Jung established 4 major universal archetypes: the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus, and the self. The self is that core of everything that we are, and it is mostly unconscious. The persona and the shadow are counterparts. They are created as adaptations to the environment and the social situations that we are in. We use our persona to express those parts of ourselves that are acceptable and palatable to our environment and to other people. These are things that are good and acceptable to our moral values, both personally and collectively. And so we develop this persona to present to the world because not all of the aspects of ourself will allow us to succeed in life. In response to that, the shadow also develops. This is where we repress all of the negative aspects. It's the darker side of the psyche, where we put shame, doubt, chaos, weakness, greed, jealousy, those aspects that are within all of us that aren't socially acceptable or morally acceptable to either ourselves as a person or to the larger collective. And so the persona and shadow form as adaptations to the world around us. And a lot of the shadow begins as repressed and may remain repressed in the unconscious. The anima, animus represent gender. So the anima is the feminine aspect of the male psyche, and the animus is the male aspect of the female psyche. And in role-playing games, we're actually able to play with all of these concepts a little bit and tap into different parts of our anima or animus that we aren't normally able to do as a result of the persona we have to wear in our lives. The self also has a collective component. And this is related to spirituality, that by tapping into the collective sense of self, that which is all that we are, and being able to unify anima, animus, and persona and shadow into a core sense of undifferentiated self, conscious and unconscious, that is the goal of adult development via the archetypes. Joseph Campbell came up with the hero's journey, and he was inspired by Carl Jung. So we can see all of these elements of the archetypes in the hero's journey. They also use similar methods studying myths across cultures. And I think this is a great outline for adult development in this sense. The hero's journey starts at a status quo. The hero is at rest, things are routine and comfortable, and they are embedded in their current way of being in their current life. The hero represents our persona, and heroes are positive aspects of ourselves and us as we move through the world. But we begin to see other aspects that come up in the hero's journey that we don't readily identify with as the persona, but maybe other aspects of self, anima, animus, and shadow. So the hero has to be called to adventure, and usually someone outside of the hero, a mentor or future mentor, will call the hero to adventure. Luke Skywalker had Obi-Wan Kenobi, Frodo had Gandalf, etc., etc. And so we're meeting our mentors, those magicians or caregivers or lovers or seekers that are archetypes in stories, but are also representatives of the collective unconscious and aspects of ourselves and aspects of our collective that we express because they are not part of our conscious awareness as outside of our persona in the hero's journey. After the call to adventure, the hero will cross the threshold into the process of adult development. And this is where they get to meet the shadow. They don't confront the shadow at this point, but they might even recognize the shadow as a character flaw or something that will foreshadow difficulty to come later on in the story. In role-playing games, we're very conscious of this at the very beginning by creating characters that have a character flaw. All good characters in role-playing games have a character flaw. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be as meaningful. And so this is how we can begin to consciously play with the shadow, even though we're not really accessing it yet. The hero also will meet different companions along the way, forms of other archetypes, and face challenges and have to overcome obstacles and kind of go through this trial to be able to face the villain. The hero is going to descend into darkness and have a supreme ordeal or near-death experience into the abyss. And this is the confrontation fully with the shadow. And at this point, the shadow may overcome the hero. The hero may not have everything they need to be able to cope with that. And this is represented mostly by villains in our stories and in the hero's journey. But in role-playing games, we do this as well, because a really good villain in a role-playing game, especially if you want it to be meaningful, is that any villain has some sort of redeemable quality, something that the hero can relate to, that we can relate to within ourselves. And we project that shadow onto the villain as outside of ourself in order to be able to start kind of working with it as an object, because while it's embedded in our unconscious and we are embedded in that, we're not able to fully realize that. And through this supreme ordeal, there's then a rescue from outside of the hero and the hero's journey. These are the other archetypes, the magician, the mentor, other allies that come to the hero's rescue. Those are archetypes, aspects of ourselves or the collective sense of self that we access to save our persona, and to be able to incorporate whatever has happened, that shadow, into our self and our persona. Through this process, the hero has a realization, something that they didn't know before that now they know. This is bringing into conscious awareness, incorporating into persona. And this requires a sacrifice, a letting go of some old way of being or knowing that is preventing us from being who we are going to be next. And through that sacrifice and realization, the hero is able to ascend and meets now a climax, which is another face-off, the final battle and catharsis with whatever developmental issue we are dealing with or aspect of our shadow or other archetypes. But this allows for the resurrection of the hero out of the shadow into the hero status once more, and provides for the resolution after the climax that establishes the new way of being, the new status quo. And in adult development and our role-playing games, this is our heightened awareness, our new consciousness, the things that we are now able to bring into our development. So this is where things get really exciting, because we're able to use the hero's journey and the archetypes and our storytelling as we play with that in our role-playing games to actually leverage adult development. And so we're accessing the unconscious. We're using creativity and even collective creativity to play through adult development. So creativity is the process of bringing fantasy into reality, and it requires tapping into our unconscious. It's a literal journey from our unconscious, using imagination to create fantasy from our unconscious and bringing that into reality. So in order to do this, Winnicott talked about the holding environment. This is the space in which this is allowed to happen, in which we are able to play. So a holding environment creates a sense of safety. It is safe enough that we can confront some of the things, maybe even parts of our shadow or ourself, that we are not familiar with, that we're uncomfortable with, and that may not be safe to present into our persona and out into the world yet. And the holding environment is really necessary to allow that play to happen in a somewhat safe environment. This also deals with a little bit of frustration, and that the holding environment can't be too perfect, so that it allows us to experience frustration and differentiate ourselves in the process. In the process of play, within the holding environment, Winnicott talks about how aspects of ourselves get projected out, and that some of them can get reflected back to us by the people we were playing with. And then also we can introject aspects of other people that we are playing with. And that helps us form a healthy sense of false self to be able to negotiate between our true self and the world around us. So since this is how the persona and shadow are formed, it is also, I think, a way to access them and to enhance them in the first place. Just like the ring must be taken back to Mordor and destroyed only in the place from whence it came, so the shadow and the persona can only be unlocked in the same way that they were originally formed in the first place. Through the process of destruction, then creation can happen into a new sense. And when we are kids, we have certain levels of play, but when we become adults, we are capable of very complex types of play, and we will do this in other aspects of our lives, and we can do this in the form of adult development as well. So how does this happen in role-playing games? Well, in role-playing games, we're playing a character, right? So we are creating a persona, a hero, and that persona may or may not relate to parts of ourselves that we also identify with. But in order to create a persona and even play with it and enact it in a game, we're going to have to tap into aspects of ourselves, whether we identify with them or not as a part of our actual persona. Somewhere they're part of us or the collective unconscious, the collective self, if they're not part of our personal persona that we're aware of. And so in order to play any character in a role-playing game or access any unconscious parts of our shadow that we may not be aware of, even if that character flaw is not a flaw, we are aware that we have. And it may not be part of our personal shadow, but it will be part of the collective shadow, at least. And so we play our characters, and that is, we have to tap into our unconscious in order to access those archetypes and those aspects of our persona or our shadow or the collective unconscious. And then we play with it. And this process of play with each other in role-playing games is what's so great about it, is we're not just using our imagination, we're using our imagination together. And so our characters interact with each other, and we interact with each other as players. And this is where we can reflect back aspects of the persona or of the character or of the player back to them, and that can be introjected and worked with. And when we tap into these collective archetypes, we're also engaging in collective creativity, because we're collectively, as a group, tapping into the collective unconscious and representing all of these archetypes together in our respective heroes' journeys, not just for our characters, but also for us as players. And that's how I think it's really important and really meaningful to play and use creativity as a way of tapping into the unconscious in role-playing games. Then we will develop as a result of that process in our own adult development hero's journey. And this is why storytelling is really so powerful in role-playing games. Because as Jung has said, development is the process of becoming conscious and unconsciously in unity with our self, anima, animus, persona, and shadow. And we're able to access the archetypes, the major archetypes, the other archetypes that are universal and part of our collective. We engage in this process as a journey. We're all on our own adult development journeys, but we're on our hero's journey through the story, and that is how we can access and work with all of these archetypes that aren't necessarily part of our consciousness at that time. And we engage in this collective creativity because whatever unconscious elements we are embedded in our own understanding of ourselves, we become embedded in the play experience, in the role-playing game together. And that allows us to draw out and differentiate the different archetypes and aspects of our shadow or our self or our persona in the hero's journey, in our characters and in ourselves as we play. And that is the bridge from unconscious using imagination into a fantasy reality that we can then differentiate and then reincorporate as we play with it and learn to understand it in a more objective way as a developmental bridge from our unconscious to our conscious awareness.